Jessica stood in line at the airport gate, feeling the nervous excitement she always did before a flight. She had worked hard for this, a rare chance to travel first class. Wearing a simple black sweater and jeans, she didn't fit the typical picture of someone in first class, but that didn't bother her. She had earned it. As she stepped forward to hand her boarding pass to the gate agent, she noticed the stares. There were some older passengers in line, dressed in expensive clothes, who looked at her like she didn't belong. A few whispered to each other. Jessica could hear the words, though they weren't meant for her ears. "She doesn't look like she can afford this," one woman muttered, looking Jessica up and down. "Probably got lucky with an upgrade." Another man whispered loudly enough for her to catch every word. Jessica's heart sank, but she didn't react. She had been judged like this her whole life. At this point, she knew the drill. People would assume the worst based on her skin color and appearance. But she was used to it. Still, she couldn't ignore the way the whispers stung. She took a deep breath and walked past them, smiling politely at the gate agent, who seemed to hesitate before scanning her ticket. "First class," the agent said, pointing her toward the door leading to the plane. As Jessica stepped onto the jet bridge, she saw him, Captain Reynolds, the pilot. He stood near the entrance of the plane, chatting with the flight attendants. He was tall, with a strong build, his uniform sharp and pressed. He looked like someone who was always in control, someone who didn't make mistakes. As he glanced toward Jessica, his expression changed for just a split second. His eyes narrowed as he scanned her from head to toe, clearly sizing her up. Without saying a word, he bumped into her as she was about to pass him. She apologized quietly, expecting him to move along. But instead, his eyes lingered on her for a moment too long. His lips pressed into a tight line, and he glanced back at the flight attendants as if silently confirming something to them. "You don't belong here," Captain Reynolds said, his voice harsh. He reached out and slapped the boarding pass out of Jessica's hand. It fluttered to the floor. The passengers who had been behind Jessica stopped in their tracks, their eyes wide with surprise and discomfort. The sounds of the plane's engine and the busy airport faded away. Jessica felt the weight of every stare, every whispered word that had followed her. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, but she didn't allow the tears to come. She simply bent down, picked up her boarding pass, and stood tall again. Captain Reynolds was still standing there, his arms crossed, as though he had just put her in her place. He didn't seem to care that she was visibly upset. If anything, he looked pleased with himself. "You heard me," he said with a smug smile. "You don't belong in first class. You're not even dressed for it." Jessica could feel the anger building inside her, but she knew better than to react with the same bitterness. She had learned long ago that fighting with people like him would never get her anywhere. But this time, something inside her snapped. She was tired of being judged, tired of people like him assuming they could get away with disrespecting her. She met his eyes without flinching, her voice calm but steady. "You'll regret this," she said quietly, but with undeniable strength. Captain Reynolds blinked, clearly surprised by her response. The smug smile faltered for just a moment. Jessica walked past him, her back straight, and entered the plane. She didn't look back. As she made her way down the aisle toward her first-class seat, she could hear the low murmurs from the passengers who had witnessed the scene. Some whispered to each other, others just stared, unsure of what had just happened. Jessica sat down in her seat, still calm, but a storm was brewing inside. The flight attendants came by shortly after, and she noticed the way they looked at her, cold, dismissive. She was used to being treated like she didn't belong, like she was invisible. But now, the anger she had been holding back for so long began to surface. Captain Reynolds eventually entered the cockpit, but Jessica couldn't help glancing toward the door. He had no idea who she was, no idea the kind of power she held, but he was about to find out. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, Jessica kept her focus on the seat in front of her. But inside, a plan was already forming. She didn't know how, and she didn't know when, but she would make sure Captain Reynolds understood exactly why he should never judge someone based on their appearance again. The flight attendants continued to ignore her, treating the other passengers with respect while barely acknowledging her presence. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, their curiosity and judgment. But Jessica wasn't worried. She had learned to rise above it all, to stay calm in the face of cruelty. It was only a matter of time before they realized that the woman they had underestimated wasn't just another passenger. Jessica knew she was about to turn the tables in a way they'd never expect. The flight was smooth, but the tension in the cabin was anything but. Jessica sat quietly in her first-class seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some of them curious, others still judgmental. It was as if the entire plane was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But Jessica remained calm, her face a mask of quiet determination. She glanced around at the other passengers. A middle-aged couple sitting across from her was whispering to each other, their eyes flicking toward her with an air of superiority. The man leaned over to his wife and muttered something she couldn't quite hear, but Jessica caught the word unbelievable before he lowered his voice again. A few rows ahead, two young women in designer outfits were chatting, but every now and then, they'd glance over their shoulders at her. Jessica could feel their silent judgment like a weight on her shoulders, but she refused to let it show. She had learned long ago that the less she reacted, the more it bothered people like them. She knew they were all thinking the same thing. She doesn't belong here. But that was exactly what she wanted them to think. They had no idea who she was, and that was exactly how she liked it. Captain Reynolds had made his move earlier, humiliating her in front of everyone. And though it had stung in the moment, Jessica knew it was just the beginning. He hadn't expected her to stand her ground. Most people wouldn't have. Most people would have cowered, apologized, or walked away. But Jessica wasn't like most people. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her thoughts. She slipped it out, careful not to draw attention. There was a message from her colleague, Marco, who worked in federal law enforcement. It read, "Just got word from the office. Everything's set. Let me know when you're ready." She smiled to herself, a small, satisfied grin that no one could see. Marco was her contact in the aviation security department. For years, they had worked together on sensitive investigations, making sure that everyone followed the rules. But today, it was different. Today, Jessica wasn't just a bystander. She was the one who would take control. The flight attendants had passed by a few times, offering drinks and snacks to the other first-class passengers, but they had barely acknowledged Jessica. She could tell by the way they looked at her that they were still in disbelief. The captain had made his judgment, and now they were treating her as if she were invisible. Jessica had dealt with this before, the silent treatment, the cold stares. She was used to people assuming they knew her, judging her based on her clothes or her appearance. But it wasn't just her appearance they were underestimating. It was her mind, her strength, and the quiet power she carried. As the flight continued, Jessica's thoughts began to race. She had always been a calm, calculated person, but today she was planning something. Something big. She wasn't going to let Captain Reynolds, or anyone else on this flight, get away with treating her like she was invisible. She would make sure they understood just how wrong they were. She had been calm until now, letting the disrespect slide. But that was about to change. Jessica wasn't going to be dismissed anymore. She wasn't going to allow someone to humiliate her in front of a whole plane of people and then walk away as if nothing had happened. It wasn't just about the slap. It wasn't just about the humiliation. It was about respect. The kind of respect she had earned, the kind that no one could take away from her, no matter how hard they tried to break her down. Jessica stood up slowly, careful not to draw attention to herself. She knew that when she moved, people would be watching her. They would be trying to figure out what she was up to. But that was the point. She wanted them to wonder. She wanted them to feel uncomfortable. She wanted them to realize that this wasn't just a woman they had underestimated. This was someone who would make them regret every second of their judgment. She walked toward the bathroom, her steps steady and purposeful. As she passed the flight attendants, she noticed them glance at her, but none of them said a word. They didn't even try to hide the smirks on their faces. Jessica could feel their eyes on her as she disappeared behind the curtain, but she didn't care. Inside the bathroom, she took a moment to steady herself. She needed to make sure everything was in place. She had to be careful. This had to be done just right. She pulled her phone out of her pocket again and tapped out a quick message to Marco. She was ready. Taking another deep breath, she slipped her phone back into her pocket and checked her reflection one last time. She wasn't here to make a scene, but to teach a lesson. Jessica had worked too hard to be treated like an outsider. She wasn't the quiet woman sitting in the back anymore. She was someone to be reckoned with. She reached up, adjusting her hair, and straightened her simple yet elegant black sweater. She'd always believed that appearances didn't define who someone was. But in this moment, she knew that if she didn't make an impact, they would keep seeing her as just another person they could dismiss. No, this time, she would control the narrative. She opened the bathroom door and stepped back out into the cabin, her heels clicking on the polished floor. The flight attendants were still gathered at the front of the cabin, chatting amongst themselves. They didn't notice her at first, too busy with their small talk. But as she walked past, their heads turned. Jessica didn't stop. She didn't glance at them. She simply walked toward the cockpit door, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But every step she took, she could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, some curious, others whispering behind their hands. She was going to do this. As she reached the cockpit door, she stopped and looked at the flight attendants. They were watching her now, waiting to see what she would do. Jessica kept her expression neutral but strong. She didn't flinch. One of the flight attendants, who had been particularly rude to her earlier, moved to block her path, her arms crossed in front of her chest. "Excuse me, miss. Can I help you with something?" The flight attendant's voice was sharp, almost mocking. Jessica glanced up at the woman, her eyes unwavering. "I need to speak to the captain," she said, her tone calm but firm. "It's important." The flight attendant raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "I'm afraid the captain is busy," she said, clearly trying to dismiss her. Jessica wasn't fazed. She took a step forward, standing tall. "You can tell him I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The attendant hesitated for a moment, eyeing Jessica as if trying to figure out her next move. After a long pause, she turned and knocked lightly on the cockpit door. "Captain Reynolds," she said, her voice a little uncertain. "There's a woman here who says she needs to speak with you. She won't leave." Jessica could hear the faint voice of Captain Reynolds on the other side of the door, his tone gruff. "Who is it?" The flight attendant hesitated. "I'm not sure. She says it's important." A moment passed before the door opened. Captain Reynolds stepped out, looking irritated. "What is it?" "I'm in the middle of something." But as soon as his eyes landed on Jessica, his face went pale. His irritation disappeared, replaced by something else, something akin to recognition. "You," he said, his voice flat, his eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" Jessica stood her ground, meeting his gaze. "I'm here to make sure you understand that you just made a very big mistake." Captain Reynolds looked at her, confusion creeping into his features. "What are you talking about? You don't belong here. We have procedures." Jessica cut him off. "I'm not just any passenger on this flight," she said, her voice low but steady. "I'm with the Federal Aviation Administration, and if you continue to disrespect me or anyone else on this plane, I'll make sure it's your last flight." The words hit him like a freight train. His eyes widened, and for a moment, he stood there speechless, the color draining from his face. "Whoa, what?" Captain Reynolds stammered, his usual confidence shaken for the first time. "You're with the FAA." Jessica nodded slowly, letting the weight of her words sink in. She could see his mind racing, trying to process what she had just said. His eyes flicked nervously to the flight attendants, who were now watching the exchange with wide eyes. They, too, had no idea who she really was. "Yes," Jessica replied, her tone unwavering. "And you just broke several regulations by discriminating against me. If I file a report, you could lose your job. And trust me, I'm not the only one who's noticed the way you've treated me and others on this flight." For a moment, Captain Reynolds stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to find the right words. But there were no words that could undo what had already happened. Jessica could see the shift in his demeanor, the tension in his posture, the way he kept glancing at the flight attendants as if hoping they would help him. But none of them spoke. It was clear that they, too, were stunned by the revelation. Finally, Captain Reynolds cleared his throat, his voice much softer now. I apologize," he said, though his words were reluctant. "I didn't know. I was wrong." Jessica nodded once, her expression unchanged. "You should be. And I hope you never make the same mistake again." As the plane continued its steady flight across the skies, Jessica sat in her first-class seat, the air around her oddly still. She felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, but there was no joy in it. This wasn't about winning. This was about making a statement. She had made her point, but there was still work to be done. She couldn't let her guard down yet. There was still one more step in her plan. Captain Reynolds had apologized, but Jessica knew that was just the beginning. He had no idea what kind of trouble he had walked into. His apology had been hollow, and she didn't trust it. People like him didn't change easily. This wasn't just about one man. It was about the system of discrimination and prejudice that ran deeper than a single flight crew. She could still feel the eyes of the passengers on her, their gazes following her as she returned to her seat. The whispers had started again. Some passengers were clearly intrigued by what had just happened, while others seemed uncomfortable. The flight attendants, though, seemed to have retreated into their own world, no longer looking her way. But she knew it wouldn't stay quiet for long. Jessica reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, tapping a few buttons quickly. She sent a message to Marco, who had been waiting for her signal. "It's time. We go live." It only took a moment before Marco replied. "Got it. You're sure?" Jessica thought for a second before replying. Yes, it's now or never. She knew that once the next step began, there would be no going back. But she was ready. It was the moment that would truly shake the plane and make everyone on board see her for who she really was. She felt the familiar vibration of her phone again. A new message from Marco. "I'm sending the details now. Prepare to act." Jessica didn't hesitate. She clicked open the message and read through it carefully. It was a report that would cause waves, official, carefully worded, and backed by evidence of Reynolds' misconduct. It was everything the FAA needed to take action against him, including details of his behavior and Jessica's authority to bring him to justice. Jessica locked the phone and set it back on her lap. The decision had been made. The rest was up to her. She needed to get everyone's attention, and she needed to do it now. As the plane soared through the sky, Jessica calmly stood up and walked to the back of the cabin, heading straight for the galley where the flight attendants were stationed. They didn't see her coming, caught up in their own conversations. But when she arrived, all eyes turned toward her. The woman who had tried to stop her earlier was there, her arms crossed and a somewhat annoyed look on her face. "Back already? What now?" she asked, but there was a tinge of nervousness in her voice. Jessica didn't respond to the woman's tone. Instead, she pulled out her phone again and pressed the button that began the broadcast. Her screen glowed bright as the official FAA logo appeared at the top, and her message began to stream live. "What's happening?" the flight attendant asked, now clearly alarmed as she watched Jessica press a few buttons. "I'm live streaming this flight to the authorities," Jessica replied coolly. "They'll be getting everything. The crew's actions, the pilot's behavior, and everything that's happened today. You can try to stop me, but it's too late. The FAA is already aware of everything, and now it's going public." The attendants around her froze, eyes widening. The woman who had first tried to block her stepped back, her mouth slightly agape. Jessica wasn't just speaking to them. She was speaking to everyone on the plane. She was making sure everyone knew exactly what was happening. And they were all going to be witnesses. "This is your last chance, Captain," Jessica continued, her voice loud enough for the rest of the cabin to hear. "You can try to apologize again, but it won't change anything. The people on this flight will know what you've done. And trust me, no apology is going to fix the damage that's already been done." There was a moment of silence. Then the door to the cockpit opened. Captain Reynolds stepped out, his face pale but his eyes flashing with anger. He looked around the cabin, seeing the tension in the air, the passengers watching with growing curiosity. "Miss, you can't do this," Reynolds said, his voice strained. "This is an overreaction." Jessica didn't back down. "You've been treating people like this for too long, Captain. It's time for someone to show you that there are consequences for your actions." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "The world isn't going to look the other way anymore. People like you are being held accountable, whether you like it or not." She could see the way the other passengers were reacting. Some were nodding in agreement, while others looked more uncomfortable. But no one was staying neutral. This wasn't just a fight between her and Captain Reynolds anymore. It was a lesson for everyone who had ever underestimated someone because of the way they looked or the way they were dressed. "I'll file a full report with the FAA," Jessica added, her voice unwavering. "This isn't just about you, Captain. It's about everyone who thinks it's okay to treat others like they don't matter." She was watching him closely, observing the nervous shift in his posture. He knew he couldn't win this. The passengers were on her side now, and that was more power than he could handle. The hum of the plane's engines continued to fill the cabin, but the atmosphere had completely shifted. It was no longer just another flight to its passengers. It had become a moment of reckoning. As Jessica sat back in her seat, her thoughts swirled. She had acted decisively, but she could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her shoulders. The moment she had set in motion couldn't be undone, and in many ways, it was just beginning. Jessica knew the eyes of everyone in the cabin were still on her. They were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Some passengers seemed supportive, nodding as if to say they understood her actions. Others, though, remained quiet, unsure of what to make of it all. It wasn't every day that someone stood up in such a bold way. But for Jessica, this wasn't about grand gestures. It was about something far more personal. The need to stand up for herself and for everyone who had ever been overlooked, disrespected, or dismissed. The flight attendants, who had been more than a little uneasy, were now scattered across the cabin. They went about their tasks, but there was a noticeable change in the way they moved, as if they were trying to avoid any further conflict. Jessica could tell that they were rattled, unsure of how to proceed. The tension in the air was palpable, and they knew they could no longer pretend nothing had happened. Captain Reynolds, on the other hand, had retreated to the cockpit, though he kept glancing out from behind the door. He knew this wasn't going away. His apology earlier had been hollow, but even he understood that what had transpired was far from over. The FAA would be involved. The media would get their hands on the story. And the next time he took a flight, he'd be remembered for all the wrong reasons. But Jessica wasn't concerned about him anymore. He was a small part of the bigger picture. It was the passengers who mattered now. She wanted them to walk away from this experience with more than just a sense of discomfort. She wanted them to understand the power of standing up for what's right, no matter the odds. For a few moments, Jessica closed her eyes and leaned back in her seat, letting the noise of the plane fade into the background. She knew she had done something important today, something that would reverberate beyond this flight. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been belittled, ignored, or made to feel like they didn't matter. The fasten seatbelt sign flickered on, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts as we begin our descent into our destination. Thank you for flying with us today." Jessica sat up and began to buckle her seatbelt. The words of the captain, though polite, were a reminder that the world kept turning, whether or not people acknowledged the injustices around them. But she wasn't going to let it slide. Not anymore. As the plane began to descend, Jessica felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see a woman in her late 20s, well-dressed, but with an expression that was hard to read. The woman had been sitting a few rows behind her, and Jessica vaguely remembered seeing her watching the exchange between her and Captain Reynolds earlier. "Excuse me," the woman said softly, leaning closer. "I just wanted to say, thank you." Jessica raised an eyebrow, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "Thank you." The woman nodded. "I was one of the passengers who heard what happened, and I just want you to know that what you did today, it mattered. You made me realize how much I've been letting slide in my own life. People like you don't get enough credit, and we need more people like you." Jessica's eyes softened. She had no idea what the woman had been through or what her life was like, but in that moment, her words felt like a validation she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about the confrontation with Captain Reynolds. It was about the ripple effect of standing up for what's right. "Thank you," Jessica said, her voice quieter now. "I didn't do it for praise. I did it because I had to." The woman nodded. "I get it. You were strong, and I admire that." Before Jessica could respond, the woman stood up, her eyes glistening slightly with emotion. She reached out and shook Jessica's hand. "You'll be remembered for this. I'm sure of it." Jessica smiled, a small, bittersweet smile. She had no idea how far this would go, but she knew that moments like this were the reason she had acted in the first place. One person's courage could spark something in others. It could change a small piece of the world for the better. As the woman walked away, Jessica's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and checked the message from Marco. The cabin was quiet as the plane finally landed. The steady hum of the engine softened as the wheels touched the tarmac, signaling the end of the flight. But for Jessica, it wasn't just the end of a journey. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Her heart raced as she thought about what was coming next. The confrontation with Captain Reynolds had been explosive, but now the real challenge lay in the fallout. She stood as the seatbelt sign turned off, gathering her belongings slowly, trying to seem composed, though her mind was a whirlwind. She could already feel the shift in the air, the whispers that were starting to spread among the passengers. Some of them had taken photos, others had been recording. Jessica had expected this. She'd known it would come, but it didn't make her any less anxious. The story of what had happened today was already beginning to leak out, and soon it would be everywhere. As the passengers filed out of the plane, a few of them turned toward her, giving her approving looks or offering quiet nods of support. Others, however, avoided eye contact, uncertain or uncomfortable about what had just transpired. But Jessica could feel the energy in the room change. The air was heavy with the realization that something significant had occurred. It wasn't just a slap or a small argument. It was a moment of power. A reminder that no one should ever be underestimated. When Jessica exited the jet bridge, she was met by airport security, who gave her a quick glance before heading toward a different direction. She had been expecting this as well. The flight crew, probably feeling the pressure of the situation, had likely already informed the authorities about the incident. Jessica wasn't worried. She knew the truth was on her side. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was a bigger issue, a reflection of the discrimination that ran deeper than any single encounter. Jessica made her way to baggage claim, her eyes scanning the crowd. She was suddenly aware of how many eyes were on her. It wasn't a bad thing. It was the reality of being the center of attention. The power she gained through her actions was something she hadn't anticipated, but it was undeniable. People were watching, people were talking, and soon enough, the story would be everywhere. She couldn't hide from it. She had to face it head-on. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an alert. The FAA had officially acknowledged the incident, and they had begun their investigation into the actions of Captain Reynolds. Jessica smiled to herself. This was it, the beginning of change. No matter how hard Reynolds tried to downplay his actions, the authorities were now involved. They had no choice but to take it seriously. But it wasn't just about the FAA's investigation. The real power lay in the public eye. That was where the battle would be won or lost. Jessica knew that the story had already been shared across social media. There was no going back. She'd made her stand, and now the world would see it. It would be up to the public to decide how they felt about it. Would they stand by her, or would they criticize her for causing a scene? Jessica had already made peace with the fact that she would face criticism. There would always be people who disagreed, people who thought she overreacted, and people who didn't believe in the cause. But she couldn't focus on that. What mattered was the support she had received from the passengers who had seen the truth. The woman who had thanked her earlier wasn't the only one who had been moved by her actions. There were others, passengers who had recorded the incident, who had shared their own stories of mistreatment. They were now part of something bigger, part of a conversation that was just beginning. As Jessica waited for her luggage, a man approached her. He was tall, well-dressed, and his demeanor suggested he was someone important. He had a calm, serious expression on his face, and Jessica instinctively knew he wasn't just any passenger. "Miss," the man said, his voice steady but respectful. "I'm sorry to approach you like this, but I wanted to say thank you. What you did today, it was inspiring." Jessica raised an eyebrow. She had been expecting reporters or authorities, but not someone like this. "Thank you." "Yes," the man nodded. "I work in media. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but your story is already making waves. People are talking about what happened on that flight, and are seeing something they haven't seen before." The days following the flight were a blur for Jessica. The moment she had stepped off that plane, everything had changed. What had started as a simple act of self-defense had quickly snowballed into a national conversation. Her name was everywhere. News outlets were covering the incident, social media exploded with opinions, and the hashtags #StandWithJessica and #NoMoreSilence were trending across the globe. Jessica's phone was ringing constantly. There were interview requests, messages of support, and countless inquiries from journalists who wanted to know more about what had happened. But the one thing Jessica wasn't doing was talking. She'd made her point on the plane, and now she was letting the truth speak for itself. The words she had said before the slap, "You'll regret this," were coming true in ways she hadn't expected. The public's reaction was mixed. Many hailed her as a hero, applauding her bravery for standing up to the pilot and showing the world that discrimination would no longer be tolerated. She became a symbol of empowerment, particularly for women and people of color who had faced similar challenges and felt powerless to speak up. They saw in Jessica a reflection of their own struggles and their own resilience. But of course, not everyone saw it that way. There were people who believed she had overreacted, who claimed she had made a scene for no reason, and who sided with Captain Reynolds, saying his actions were out of frustration, not malice. A few defended him, saying it was an accident, that it wasn't worth blowing up into a public spectacle. Jessica ignored the critics. She had learned over the years to tune out negativity. But there were moments, in the quiet of her apartment, when she couldn't help but wonder if she was truly ready for everything that was happening. The spotlight wasn't something she had asked for, and while she felt proud of what she had done, the pressure was beginning to mount. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Marco. "The FAA investigation is ramping up. The crew is being questioned, and there's a lot of media attention around Captain Reynolds. I've been in contact with the airline's legal team. They are trying to manage the fallout." Jessica sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the screen. The email from Marco confirmed what she already knew. The captain was under intense scrutiny. His actions had opened a Pandora's box. The FAA wasn't just looking at the slap. They were digging into the deeper issue of systemic racism and discrimination that seemed to be a recurring problem in the airline industry. As the investigation continued, more passengers from the flight came forward. They shared their accounts, some of them providing evidence, photos and videos of the altercation that no one had known existed at the time. With each new testimony, the weight of Captain Reynolds' actions became even clearer. This wasn't a small mistake. This was a pattern of behavior that had been ignored for far too long. Jessica sat at her kitchen table, reading through the articles and reports. She was gaining support from all corners, but it wasn't just the public who was backing her. Lawyers had contacted her, offering their help, while organizations fighting for racial equality reached out to offer their support. It was becoming evident that her story wasn't just hers anymore. It was the story of everyone who had ever been dismissed because of their race, their gender, or their background. Then a notification popped up on her phone, this one from the news. Captain Reynolds suspended. FAA investigation underway. Jessica smiled to herself, a mix of satisfaction and relief washing over her. She hadn't sought revenge. She hadn't set out to destroy someone's life, but she had stood her ground, and that made all the difference. The message was clear. The world was watching, and people were ready to hold others accountable for their actions. A few days later, Jessica received a formal letter from the airline. They had reviewed the incident, and after thorough investigation, Captain Reynolds was placed on indefinite suspension. The airline issued a public apology to Jessica, acknowledging the harm caused by their employees' actions. While the apology didn't erase the hurt, it was a step in the right direction. The letter also contained a promise to implement diversity and sensitivity training for all employees, ensuring that what had happened to Jessica wouldn't happen again. Jessica sat down with a deep breath, the weight of the situation sinking in. She had made a real change, not just for herself, but for others who would come after her. The airline had taken responsibility, and the public had been forced to confront an issue that had been swept under the rug for far too long. Captain Reynolds may have been the one to slap her, but it was the system he represented that had been exposed. Her phone rang again, but this time, it was different. It had been weeks since the flight incident. The world had moved on, but Jessica's life had shifted in ways she never could have anticipated. As the news coverage slowed and the social media chatter began to fade, she found herself navigating a new normal. A normal where she wasn't just Jessica, the quiet woman trying to go unnoticed, but a woman whose bravery had sparked a movement. The airport and airline had settled into their own versions of peace, but for Jessica, the true work was just beginning. She had become a voice for those who felt powerless, and her story was now part of a larger conversation about accountability, respect, and equality. It was the last thing she had expected when she boarded that flight. She had just been trying to get home, just another person on a plane, hoping to get from point A to point B without any drama. But everything had changed in that moment when Captain Reynolds had slapped her boarding pass out of her hand, assuming she didn't belong. It was a microcosm of something much larger, something that had been building in the shadows for years. Now, Jessica stood at the front of a small conference room, the walls lined with photographs and memorabilia. On the table in front of her were notes for the speech she would be giving later that day. She had been invited to speak at a diversity and inclusion conference, a big opportunity to use her platform to push for real change. The room was filled with people who had come to listen, some of them industry professionals, others who were advocates for racial equality. All of them had heard her story. Some of them were already working on similar issues in their fields, while others were just beginning their own journeys toward understanding. Jessica's nerves were tingling, but she knew what she had to do. She had to make sure that the message wasn't lost, that her story wasn't just another viral moment, but a catalyst for lasting change. As she stood there, the door to the conference room opened, and a woman entered. She was dressed in a sharp suit, her demeanor professional but kind. She smiled warmly at Jessica, extending her hand. "You're Jessica, right? The one who took down a pilot with a single sentence," she said, her voice friendly but filled with admiration. Jessica chuckled softly and shook the woman's hand. "I wouldn't say I took him down, but yes, that's me. I just wanted to say how much your story has meant to so many people," the woman continued. You've inspired us all to stand up for what's right, no matter the consequences." Jessica smiled, feeling a sense of humility wash over her. She wasn't used to being a symbol, but now, standing in this room with people who truly understood the significance of her actions, she felt a quiet sense of pride. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been discriminated against, every person who had been silenced. "You know," Jessica began, looking around at the room full of faces, "when it happened on that plane, I didn't think it was going to be this big. I just thought I had to stand up for myself. I didn't even think about what it would mean to everyone else." A few people in the room nodded, clearly understanding. They had heard similar stories from others who had faced prejudice and bias, but Jessica's had taken the world by storm. It wasn't just her bravery that had resonated. It was the simplicity of it, the rawness, the moment when she had calmly looked at Captain Reynolds and said, "You'll regret this." That moment had crystallized the frustration and strength of so many people, people who had felt powerless, overlooked, and dismissed. "Standing up for myself wasn't easy," Jessica continued, her voice steady. "But standing up for everyone else, that's the part that's still hard to grasp. This is bigger than just one flight. This is about a system, a culture that has been in place for far too long, a culture that allows people to assume others don't belong just based on their appearance or background. We've all been taught that we're supposed to keep our heads down, not make waves. But sometimes, the only way to make things right is to make waves." She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. The room was completely silent, everyone listening intently. "It's not about being perfect," she added. "It's about doing what you can with what you have. It's about making sure that no one else has to endure what I did. The slap may have been physical, but the real slap was the one that society gave all of us by allowing this kind of thing to happen. And if my story can make just one person think twice before judging someone else, then I've done what I set out to do." There was a murmur of agreement, and a few people clapped softly. Jessica smiled and nodded, acknowledging the moment. It wasn't about applause. It was about the conversation she was helping to create. She knew this was just the beginning of something bigger. As the conference continued, Jessica found herself engaged in conversations with people who were passionate about making real change. She exchanged ideas with activists, business leaders, and others who were eager to take her story and use it to push for policies, better workplace environments, and more education around diversity and inclusion. The more she spoke, the more she realized that her journey wasn't just about the flight incident. It was about being part of a movement that was already growing. By the time the conference came to a close, Jessica felt a sense of fulfillment. Her story had reached so many people, and now it was in their hands to carry it forward. She hadn't just made a difference for herself. She had made a difference for everyone who had been overlooked, ignored, or mistreated. As she stepped out of the conference room and into the bustling streets of the city, Jessica took a deep breath and smiled. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun, but she was ready for whatever came next.